The gavel hit the wooden bench with a sound that felt like a bullet to my chest. In less than 20 minutes, my father-in-law, Judge Arthur Vance, took away my home, my savings, and my dignity. He looked down at me from his high chair, adjusted his gold-rimmed glasses, and whispered, "You brought nothing into this family, and you'll leave with nothing." My husband didn't even look me in the eye. I walked out of that courtroom broken, penniless, and stripped of everything I had worked for. But Judge Vance made one fatal mistake. He assumed my late mother was just an ordinary, quiet schoolteacher who died penniless. He had no idea what she hid in a sealed safety deposit box 20 years ago, or how one long-forgotten secret was about to turn his entire legal empire into ash. Follow my story to the very end, and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is Clara Sterling. At 28 years old, I stood in a chilly courthouse corridor watching my entire life shatter into pieces. Just 3 years ago, I thought I was marrying into a life of stability and warmth when I said, "I do," to Julian Vance. Julian was charming, soft-spoken, and deeply devoted to his father, Judge Arthur Vance, a man whose formidable presence dominated every room he walked into. In our city, Judge Vance wasn't just a legal authority, he was an institution. He controlled our family dynamic with a quiet, iron authority disguised as protection and prestige. But when Julian abruptly filed for divorce after a series of orchestrated arguments, the mask slipped entirely. My father-in-law didn't just support his son. He personally pulled the levers of the court system to ensure I was thoroughly dismantled. Leveraging his political influence and deep network of legal favors, Judge Vance fabricated financial claims against me, framing my modest savings as marital debt. In a matter of weeks, he stripped away my emergency funds, my home, and my dignity. On the day the final decree was stamped, Judge Vance leaned over the railing of the bench, his steel-gray eyes locking onto mine with absolute contempt. "You brought nothing into this family, Clara," he murmured, making sure only I could hear. "And I'll ensure you leave with nothing." He genuinely believed he had crushed me beyond repair. He had no idea what was waiting for me in the dark. 3 weeks later, I was living out of a cardboard-filled studio apartment on the rough edge of town, working back-to-back retail shifts just to cover basic rent and cheap canned soup. The humiliation was a heavy, suffocating blanket. Every morning I woke up to the bitter reality that Judge Vance had successfully erased me, leaving me penniless and exhausted while Julian continued living in luxury. Desperate for cash, I spent a rainy Sunday clearing out my late mother's old, dusty storage unit. I couldn't afford the monthly rental fee anymore and was just hours away from abandoning it entirely. My mother, Evelyn, had passed away 6 years prior. She had been a gentle, quiet middle school history teacher who lived modestly and died with barely enough in her bank account to cover funeral expenses. Or so I had always believed. As I stacked her cardboard boxes near the metal roll-up door, my shoulder caught the edge of a heavy wooden bookshelf. It tipped forward, crashing onto the concrete floor and splintering apart. Beneath the hollowed-out baseboard lay a rusted, rectangular tin box wrapped in oilcloth, taped shut years ago. Curiosity overriding my exhaustion, I pried the rusted lock open with a screwdriver. Inside, resting on a bed of yellowed velvet, wasn't jewelry or sentimental trinkets. There was a heavy brass key, a series of sealed vault registration papers, and a handwritten letter addressed to me in my mother's unmistakable, elegant script. My hands trembled as I unfolded my mother's letter right there under the flickering fluorescent light of the storage unit. Her words were urgent, instructing me to take the brass key and vault papers to First National Security vaults in downtown Chicago if I ever found myself facing insurmountable trouble. The next morning, I stood inside the underground vault facility. The air was cold, smelling of old paper and polished brass. A solemn clerk led me down a long, quiet corridor lined with hundreds of metallic lockboxes. He inserted his master key alongside my brass key, turned the mechanism, and withdrew a deep steel box before leaving me alone in a private viewing room. When I lifted the heavy metal lid, my heart slammed against my ribs. There were no stacks of cash or glittering jewels, but something far more powerful, Thick legal dockets, original land deeds, and non-disclosure agreements from 30 years ago. As I turned the yellowed pages, my mother's real past unfolded before my eyes. Evelyn Sterling had not always been a middle school teacher. In her late 20s, she had been a silent founding partner in a massive commercial land development company that quietly acquired huge swaths of property right before the city's major expansion. Included in the box were confidential ledger books documenting massive dividend payouts and corporate shares held in a private trust. But what made my blood run cold was the signature on the early incorporation papers and correspondence. 30 years ago, before he ever wore judicial robes, a young, hungry attorney had managed her trust, drafted those contracts, and handled the legal structure of her partnership. The signature at the bottom of every single document, written in dark black ink, belonged to Arthur Vance. I sat in the dim light of the vault's viewing room for nearly an hour, staring at Arthur Vance's young signature. The pieces of the puzzle were finally coming together, but I needed professional help to fully decipher the paper trail. The next day, using the last of my savings, I retained an independent forensic accountant and a private attorney who operated far outside Judge Vance's circle of political influence. What they uncovered over the next 72 hours was nothing short of a criminal masterpiece. When my mother passed away 6 years ago, she had been fighting a quiet, deteriorating illness. Exploiting her weakened state and complete trust, Arthur Vance had systematically forged her signature on power of attorney transfers and fraudulent corporate buyouts. He didn't just steal her dividends, he dissolved her private trust and absorbed her entire equity stake into a network of offshore shell companies. Those stolen land shares became the primary financial foundation for his entire empire. He used my mother's money to purchase his multi-million-dollar estate, fund Julian's elite education, and finance the aggressive political campaigns that eventually landed him on the judicial bench. Every piece of luxury the Vance family flaunted, the very house and assets Arthur had smugly stripped from me during my divorce, had been bought with money stolen directly from my mother. My attorney slammed the audit summary onto his desk, his face pale with astonishment. "Clara, this isn't just a civil dispute over an estate," he said, looking at me with dead seriousness. "This is decades of grand larceny, wire fraud, forgery, and systematic breach of fiduciary duty committed by a sitting judge. He didn't just cheat your mother, he built his whole career on a crime, and he used that stolen power to crush you in court." Looking at the evidence spread out before me, the helplessness I'd carried since the divorce vanished, replaced by a cold, burning resolve. Judge Vance thought he had left me with nothing. He had no idea he had just handed me the key to his complete destruction. My attorney and forensic accountant urged me to file an immediate emergency lawsuit, but I knew better. Arthur Vance was a seasoned judge with judges, prosecutors, and politicians in his pocket. A standard lawsuit in a local courtroom would be buried, delayed, or dismissed before it ever saw the light of day. To bring down a man like him, I had to bypass his entire network and hit him where he was most vulnerable, his public legacy. Instead of revealing my hand, I played the long game. My legal team quietly submitted our comprehensive evidence packet directly to federal prosecutors and the State Judicial Conduct Commission, opening a silent, confidential investigation into Judge Vance's financial holdings. Meanwhile, I let him believe his victory over me was absolute. Over the next 2 weeks, I watched from the shadows as local news outlets announced a massive upcoming gala. Judge Vance was preparing to announce his official retirement from the bench and launch his high-profile campaign for the state Supreme Court. The event was set to be attended by the city's top legal minds, politicians, and media outlets. It was meant to be the crowning achievement of his 40-year career. Through my attorney, I arranged for the federal authorities to complete their initial review just days before the gala. The evidence of grand larceny, forgery, and tax evasion was so undeniable that a federal judge quietly signed off on an asset freeze and a sealed indictment. My attorney handed me a copy of the official subpoena and court order, his voice steady. "The trap is set, Clara. He thinks he's celebrating his rise to power tonight. He has no idea his empire is about to crumble in front of the entire state." The grand ballroom of the Grand Plaza Hotel was blinding with crystal chandeliers and overflowing with champagne. Over 300 of the state's most influential figures, senators, top prosecutors, and prominent defense attorneys, had gathered to honor Judge Arthur Vance. I stood near the back of the room, dressed in a simple dark suit, watching him stand at the podium. He beamed with supreme arrogance, basking in the applause as he prepared to announce his candidacy for the state Supreme Court. Beside him stood my ex-husband Julian, smiling smugly as if he had earned every bit of his father's glory. Just as Judge Vance cleared his throat to speak, the heavy oak doors at the back of the room burst open. 4 federal agents in dark suits strode down the center aisle, flanked by 2 uniformed federal marshals. The room fell into a stunned, dead silence. The lead agent marched straight up the steps of the stage, bypassing the security guards, and presented Judge Vance with a thick stack of legal documents. Arthur Vance, the agent's voice echoed through the microphone, cutting through the silence. By order of the United States District Court, your personal and commercial assets have been frozen under suspicion of grand larceny, tax fraud, and systematic forgery. Gasps erupted throughout the ballroom. Cameras flashed frantically as reporters scrambled forward. Julian stood frozen, his face draining of all color as he looked around in sheer terror. I walked slowly down the center aisle, my heels clicking softly against the marble floor until I stood at the foot of the stage. Judge Vance's hands shook as he stared at the federal warrant. Then his eyes met mine. I reached into my jacket, pulled out a framed, high-resolution copy of the 30-year-old partnership deed signed by my mother and held it up for him to see. "You told me I brought nothing into this family, Arthur," I said, my voice quiet, clear, and resonant in the quiet room. "You were wrong. My mother built everything you thought you owned." The great judge collapsed back into his chair, clutching his chest as federal agents escorted him off the stage in handcuffs. The downfall of the Vance family was swift and absolute. Within 6 months, Arthur Vance was convicted of federal wire fraud and grand larceny, trading his judicial robes for a federal prison uniform. Stripped of his wealth and credibility, Julian was forced to sell off what little remained to pay back taxes and legal fees, ending up broke and disgraced. Through the courts, I was awarded full restitution, reclaiming not only my mother's stolen millions, but also complete ownership of the properties Arthur had tried to withhold from me. With my mother's legacy finally restored, I moved to a quiet coastal town and established the Evelyn Sterling Legal Defense Fund, a nonprofit dedicated to providing free legal representation to women facing abusive, high-conflict divorces against powerful men. Looking out over the ocean today, I know my mother's spirit is finally at peace. She didn't just leave me an inheritance. She gave me the strength to stand up, fight back, and reclaim my life. What would you have done if you found out your entire life was stolen by someone you trusted? Comment below, and don't forget to watch the recommended videos on your screen for more stories. Thank you for watching.